Humanity left in silence. The Galactic Council understood the danger too late. The signal cut out on a Wednesday. I know it was a Wednesday because I had a half-eaten sandwich on my desk and a scheduling dispute about grain shipments open on my secondary screen. The Velkari delegate, a tall, gray-skinned being named Orvith who smelled faintly of copper and always wore a robe 2 sizes too large, was mid-sentence about import tariffs. His mouth was still moving when the feed died. Not static, not a dropped connection, just gone. A clean, instant black. I stared at the screen for 4 seconds, maybe 5. Then I tried the backup channel. Dead. The emergency relay. Dead. The old analog frequency we kept around mostly as a joke. Dead. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the window of the diplomatic suite on Concord IV Station. Outside, the docking ring held 17 ships from 9 different species. I counted them, the way you count things when your brain needs something simple to do. 17 ships. I could name every species, every captain, every cargo manifest. I had spent 11 years building those relationships, learning those names, memorizing the small courtesies that matter so much more than people think. I watched as, one by one, all 17 ships disengaged from their berths and turned toward open space. No announcements, no docking protocols, no goodbye. They just left. I went back to my desk. I picked up my sandwich. I put it down again without eating it. I opened a message to the council liaison office on the station and typed, "All channels appear to be offline. Please advise." I sent it. The sending animation spun and spun and spun. Then it stopped with a small red symbol I had never seen before. It wasn't an error code I recognized. I looked it up in the station's communication manual. The code meant, recipient no longer registered on network. The entire council liaison office had been deregistered, not closed, not moved, deregistered as if it had never existed. I sat alone in a room that still smelled faintly of copper and decided to write down everything I was feeling in order so I wouldn't lose my mind. The list went like this: confused, then frightened, then more confused, then something that wasn't quite either of those things. Something colder. A specific kind of stillness that I had felt once before, as a child, when I realized the adults around me did not actually know what they were doing. My name is Mara. I am, or was, humanity's senior trade envoy to the Galactic Council. I have a doctorate in xenolinguistics, a second degree in comparative economics, and I once spent 14 hours in a negotiation about the correct definition of the word soon, with a species that experiences time in non-linear intervals. I am, by any reasonable measure, a patient person. I called Earth. The signal took 4 minutes to arrive, which was normal. What was not normal was that I had to use a private civilian band because every official government frequency had gone quiet. I got through to a communications officer named George Albright at the Ministry of Interstellar Affairs. He was 26 years old and sounded like he had not slept. He told me what I already knew. Every channel was dead. Every alien vessel in human space had departed. Every automated supply station managed by council species had sent a single shutdown ping and gone offline. All of it all at once. George said the Prime Minister was about to address the nation. He said the military was moving to elevated readiness. He said several generals were using the word invasion. I told him it was not an invasion. Invasions have ships moving toward you. These ships were moving away. He paused and said that was a fair point. I told him I would be on the next available transport home and to tell anyone who would listen not to make any sudden movements. Then I sat back down in my empty station and I thought. Not about what had happened, about what I had missed. 11 years. 11 years of conversations, treaties, trade deals, and small moments of real connection across species lines. Orvith had taught me to play a game like chess, except with 7 dimensions and no fixed rules. Captain Lissa of the Iharan trading fleet had once shared a meal with me that smelled like old books and tasted like the feeling of finishing something difficult. I had learned 17 languages well enough to argue, and 3 well enough to apologize properly. And not one of them had warned me, Not one. That was the part I could not make fit, no matter how I turned it over. These were not cold beings. They were not incapable of kindness. I had seen Orvith pause a negotiation once because he noticed I was tired and suggest we continue after I had rested. I had seen the Iharan captain spend an hour teaching a junior crew member a navigation technique they already knew, simply because the young one was embarrassed to ask a second time. These were beings who understood care, and they had left without a word. I was still thinking about that when the automated beacon found my receiver. It came in on a frequency so old that my system almost didn't catch it. A dead frequency, one listed in the Council's historical archive as decommissioned 400 years ago. I almost dismissed it. Instead, I let it run. It was a burst signal, short, repeating, in a language I didn't know at first glance but which shared root structures with two Council languages I did know. I started working on it the way you work on a problem when you have nothing else to do, methodically from the outside in. It took me 9 hours. The signal was not long. It was not complex. It was a single automated message, the kind a buoy sends when it has been waiting so long it no longer expects anyone is listening. The translation was rough. Languages this old resist clean conversion, but the core of it came through. It said the silence has been chosen. The ledger is being updated. We are sorry. We were not brave enough. We hope you are. I read it 3 times. Then I saved every copy I could, encrypted it 6 ways, and stored it in 4 separate locations, including one I had memorized and would never write down. I did not know what the ledger was, not yet, but I knew what it felt like to read those words. It felt like being handed a map of a place you had always suspected existed, but hoped you were wrong about. The transport back to Earth took 6 days. I spent all 6 of them working on the beacon's language. I ate meals I cannot remember. I slept 4 hours a night and dreamed of empty docking bays. By the time the transport touched down, I could read the beacon's origin header. It had been broadcasting for 230 years. And the species that sent it no longer existed. The first 3 months were the loudest I can remember. Every government on Earth had an opinion. Every military had a plan. Every news network ran the same 5 graphics in rotation. The words galactic betrayal, alien conspiracy, and act of war appeared so frequently that they stopped meaning anything, the way a word does when you repeat it too many times. I gave 7 testimonies to parliamentary committees in 4 countries. I answered the same questions in different orders. Yes, I was there. No, I didn't know it was coming. No, I don't think they're preparing to attack us. Yes, I'm certain. No, I can't prove it yet. I kept the beacon translation to myself for a while longer, not because I was hiding it, because I needed to understand it first, and because the moment I shared it publicly, I would lose control of it, and I had a feeling that whatever it meant, it needed to be handled carefully. While the governments argued, something else was happening, something quieter and more important. People were getting to work. The Council had been supplying humanity with medical compounds for 30 years under a trade arrangement that seemed generous at the time. Several critical treatments for common diseases came from Council-controlled synthesis facilities. When those facilities went dark, medical researchers on Earth faced a choice between waiting and figuring it out themselves. They chose, with the specific determination of people who have no other option, to figure it out themselves. A research team in Cape Town spent 11 weeks on a compound that the Council had supplied for 2 decades, a compound that had always been delivered as a finished product with no formula attached. The Council called it proprietary. The team called it a puzzle. They solved it in 79 days. In the process, they discovered that the Council's version contained an unnecessary stabilizing agent that actually reduced effectiveness by about 12%. Their version worked better. A virologist named Caroline Holt published the results and added a note at the end of her paper that read, "In the measured language of scientific journals, it is possible that our previous reliance on external supply chains obscured certain avenues of inquiry that would have otherwise been apparent." What she meant, And what everyone reading it understood was, we could have done this years ago if we'd had to. That happened over and over again, in field after field during those first months. A materials engineer named Paul Draper had spent years studying a fragment of alien hull plating that the Council had donated to a university research program. The Council had always described the underlying technology as too complex for human manufacturing at this stage of development. Paul disagreed. He had been disagreeing, politely and with meticulous documentation, for 6 years. With the Council gone and no one left to tell him he was wrong, Paul borrowed equipment, called in every favor he had, and assembled a team of 8 people in a converted warehouse outside Bristol. They worked for 4 months without a breakthrough. The 9th month produced a usable result. The 11th month produced something Paul described to his team as not quite right, but magnificently wrong in a very useful direction. Month 14 produced the first working prototype of what would eventually be called the Spite Drive. Paul named it that himself. His funding application to the British Space Agency read, in its executive summary section, proposed propulsion system based on reverse-engineered Council hull technology, developed entirely out of the conviction that we are perfectly capable of doing this ourselves. The application was approved in 48 hours. The agency director, a woman named Helen Frost, later said she approved it partly because of the technical merits, and partly because the tone of the application reminded her that demoralized people do not write funding applications like that. I was watching all of this happen from a small office in the Ministry of Interstellar Affairs, where I had set myself up with a permanent pot of tea and increasingly organized stacks of notes about the beacon. The ledger, that was the word I kept returning to. The beacon had used it as though I would know what it meant, the way you use the name of a place when speaking to someone you assume has been there. I didn't know what it meant, but the structure of the sentence suggested it was a record of some kind, a list, and whatever was being added to it was significant enough to prompt an automated apology message that had been broadcasting for 230 years. I started working backward. The beacon's origin language shared structures with 2 Council languages, which meant it predated them, which meant it was old. Very old. I began pulling every historical record I could access, which was considerably fewer than before the silence since Council archives had gone with everything else. What I had were my own notes, 11 years of personal logs, observations, and the habit I had developed early in my career of writing down anything that seemed interesting even if I didn't know why yet. I found 3 references in my own notes, small things I had registered and filed away without knowing they mattered. The first was a comment Orvith had made in my 3rd year during a long evening of the chess-like game and a particularly honest conversation. He had said, in reference to a species I had asked about, they were placed beyond reach before they could be endangered. I had written it down because the phrasing was unusual, placed, not lost, not gone, placed. The second was a moment at a Council function in my 6th year, when I overheard 2 delegates from a species called the Thren speaking quietly in their own language, which I understood enough of to follow loosely. One said something like, "The new ones are adapting faster than estimated." The other replied with a phrase that translated roughly as, "It will not matter." They had stopped speaking when they noticed me nearby. The third was the most significant. In my 9th year, I had been given access to a restricted historical database as part of a trade negotiation that involved intellectual property rights to ancient texts. The access window was 3 hours. I had been looking for something specific and hadn't found it, but I had passed through a section of records that listed, under the heading of inactive engagement status, a series of species names followed by dates. The dates were spaced irregularly. Some were thousands of years apart. Some were centuries. The most recent entry was dated 4 years before first contact with humanity. I had noted it as unusual at the time and moved on. I was not moving on anymore. I pulled out that note and stared at it for a long time. Then I began to count the entries I could remember. My memory for details is good, a professional requirement, but I hadn't been trying to memorize the list. I could recall parts of it, enough to see a pattern. The entries were not random. They clustered around certain periods, and the most recent cluster was dense. I built a timeline on the wall of my office using paper because I trusted paper. Physical, unchangeable, mine. Every species on that list had at one point been a member of the Galactic Council, or a candidate for membership, or a species that Council records had identified as developing. And then they were listed as inactive. No further entries. No notes about what happened to them. I cross-referenced with what little I could find in human-authored xenohistory texts. 3 of the species I could remember from the list appeared in human academic literature. All 3 were described as extinct. All 3 extinctions were listed as mysterious or unexplained. All 3 had disappeared within a century of their most significant period of technological advancement. I sat with that information for 2 days before I told anyone. The person I told was Helen Frost, the space agency director who had funded Paul's project. I chose her because she had a reputation for hearing difficult things without flinching, and because Paul trusted her, and because I needed to tell someone who would not immediately try to make it into a political event. We met in her office on a gray November afternoon. I showed her my timeline. I showed her my notes. I showed her the beacon translation. I explained my theory as clearly and carefully as I could, that the Galactic Council was aware of an ongoing threat that destroyed civilizations in a pattern, that they had developed a policy of allowing newly spacefaring species to encounter that threat while they retreated, that humanity had been admitted to the Council, at least in part, to be positioned in the path of whatever this threat was. Helen listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So they used us as a shield." I said, "I think they thought of it more as a sacrifice." She looked at the timeline on the table between us. Then she said, "Paul's drive, how close is it to being ready for deep space?" I said, "He says 18 months. It might be 14 if we need it to be." She said, "We might need it to be." Then she picked up the phone on her desk and started making calls. Those calls and the meetings that followed them and the 18 months of work that came after are another story and a longer one. The short version is this: humanity, having been abandoned by every ally it had in the universe, made a decision with very little debate and remarkable speed. We were going to find out what was coming, and we were going to find out why, and we were not going to wait for anyone's permission. The Rancor, which was the name given to humanity's first deep space vessel, by a public vote that Paul said was deeply unsettling but also entirely correct, launched on a cold March morning from a site in the Highlands of Scotland. It held a crew of 41. It ran on a drive that Paul had named after Spite, and that still made a sound no one could fully explain during acceleration. It carried 11 years of my notes, 300 years of xenohistorical research, and a translation of a 230-year-old apology from a species that no longer existed. I was on it. I was the only diplomat on board, because we were not sure what we were going to find, and someone needed to know how to talk to things. I spent the first week of travel reviewing my notes, eating poorly, and sleeping badly. On the 8th day, we received a signal from outside the ship. It was on the same dead frequency as the original beacon. It was brief, and it was in the same old language. It said, "You were not supposed to survive long enough to come this far." I wrote back, "We know. Where are you?" It took 11 hours for the reply. When it came, it contained coordinates. We went. The coordinates led to a relay point. An old council communications hub, the kind used centuries ago before faster methods made them obsolete. It was drifting, unpowered, but its emergency beacon was active, running on a backup cell that could last another 100 years, broadcasting on a frequency no one had used since before humanity discovered radio. We matched orbit and sent a shuttle. The station was empty, had been empty for a very long time, but the message archive was intact, sealed in a format I recognized from my research on early council records. It took our team 2 days to access it properly. What we found inside was not what any of us expected. It was not tactical data. It was not a map or a weapon or a technical blueprint. It was a library. 612 years of documentation, compiled by a species called the Orath who had been, by all available evidence, exactly where humanity now was. Young, curious, newly admitted to the council, positioned carefully by the same people who had positioned us. The Orath had figured it out faster than we did. They had found the pattern, identified the threat, and done what anyone would do with that information. They had gone to the council and demanded answers. What they got instead was removal from the network, a faster, cleaner silence than ours. No beacon, no warning, just gone. But before they went, they had built this station. They had filled it with everything they knew, and they had put it in a place where only a species who already knew to look for old frequencies on dead channels would ever find it. They had left it for us. I read their documentation for 3 days. I did not sleep much. I ate what people brought me and thanked them without remembering what they had brought. The Orath were thorough, meticulous. They wrote with the specific desperation of people who know they are running out of time but refuse to let the work go unfinished. The threat had a name in their language that did not translate cleanly. In my working notes, I called it the Sorrow Tide, because that was the closest meaning I could pull from the structure of the word. It was not a fleet. It was not a species. The Orath described it as something much older than either of those things, something that moved through the galaxy on a rhythm they had measured and mapped across 11,000 years of recorded council history. The council knew. They had always known. The Sorrow Tide came in cycles, not perfectly predictable but regular enough to plan around. The council's response, developed over millennia, was elegant in the way that deeply terrible things sometimes are. Identify the species nearest to the tide's path, arrange their presence in that region, and ensure the tide spent itself on them rather than on council worlds. They had been doing it for longer than most council species could remember. It had become policy, then procedure, then habit. The Orath documentation included a partial list of species used this way. It was longer than my estimate had been. Much longer. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked our communications officer, a calm and efficient man named George Albright, the same George who had taken my call from the station 11 years ago and who had since decided his future was apparently in space, to prepare a broadcast on every active council frequency. Every one they had closed to us. Every channel they thought was theirs alone. He looked at the list and said, "That's going to get their attention." I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you ready for that?" I thought about Orvith, who smelled of copper and had taught me a game and had not warned me. I thought about the Orath, who had spent their last weeks building a library for a species they would never meet, out of the hope that someone would come looking. I thought about Paul's drive, which made an inexplicable sound and had brought us here entirely out of stubbornness. I said, "Broadcast it." The message I sent was in Velkari formal register, which is a language designed for moments of diplomatic gravity. It is also, notably, a language in which it is very difficult to be subtle. The formal register strips away softness. What remains is precise, exact, and carries the weight of exactly what you intend. The message said, "We have read the Orath documentation. We understand the ledger. We are at the relay point at these coordinates. We are not leaving. We are requesting a conversation with the full council, all member species, on the record. If you do not respond within 72 hours, we will begin broadcasting the Orath documentation on every public frequency we can reach, including those accessible to developing species currently unaware of council policy." Then I added in plain human English, because I wanted it to be personal, "We survived. You should probably talk to us." Then I waited. I was very good at waiting by this point. The council responded in 41 hours. The chamber where the full Galactic Council met in session was the largest enclosed space I had ever stood in. It was not designed for humans. The ceiling was 30 meters up and lit in a way that suggested early morning on a world with 3 suns. There were 214 seats arranged in a pattern that looked random, but which I had learned from the Orath documentation was actually a precise hierarchical map of political weight. The oldest species sat nearest the center. The newest sat at the outer edges. There was no seat for humanity in the original arrangement. They had placed a chair at the far periphery, smaller than the others, positioned so that the angle of the overhead lighting made it slightly harder to see than everything around it. I moved the chair to the center of the floor before anyone arrived. I set it directly in front of the speaker's position. A council staff member came and told me, very politely, that this was not the designated seating position. I said, "I know, please leave the chair where it is." The staff member left and did not come back with an objection. That told me something useful about the mood of the room. The session began. 214 delegates. I knew some of them personally. I had negotiated with them, shared meals with them, learned their languages well enough to understand when they were being honest and when they were performing honesty. Several of them would not meet my eyes when they entered. Several others met them immediately and held them, in the way that beings hold the eyes of someone they are not sure how to feel about. The council chair, a being from a species called the Thren who had been in that position for longer than some human nations had existed, opened the session in the formal universal language. The opening statement was procedural. Procedural things take time. I let it take time. I had notes in my lap, and I had practiced what I was going to say so many times that it had stopped feeling like words and started feeling like breathing. When the chair finished, there was a pause. The pause was for me. I stood. I did not begin with the Orath documentation. I did not begin with the ledger. I did not begin with any of the things I had prepared to use as leverage, because leverage was for negotiations where you didn't already know the outcome, and I already knew the outcome of this one. I had known it since the relay station. I began with Orvith. I told the council that I had met Orvith in my first month as envoy, that he had spent an afternoon teaching me his game, and that I had been bad at it and he had been patient. I told them that in 11 years of diplomacy, he had been consistently thoughtful, fair, and kind, and that I had considered him a genuine friend. I told them that I had thought about him often during the years of silence, and that the thought was not comfortable, because it forced me to hold two things at once: that he was someone I trusted, and that he had made a choice I could not forgive. Then I put the Orath documentation on the council's shared display, all 612 years of it. I did not summarize it. I let them see it whole. The room was very quiet for a long time. The chair spoke first, in a voice that was carefully controlled in the way that very old beings learn to control things. He said that the council was aware of the documentation's existence, that the policy it described had been reviewed many times over the centuries by many councils, that it was not a decision made lightly or maintained carelessly, that the sorrow tide was a threat that had destroyed 22 civilizations before the policy was implemented, and that the policy had protected hundreds. I said, it protected them by spending others. The chair said, yes. The word fell into the room like something heavy and stayed there. I said, and when you admitted humanity to the council, you already knew we were being positioned. The chair said, the projections at the time of admission indicated that humanity was not yet sufficiently developed to represent a significant strategic loss. I had known that answer was coming. I had prepared for it, and it still hit harder than I expected. I stood there for a moment and let it hit, because that was honest, and I had decided honesty was the only thing worth bringing into this room. Then I said, the projections were wrong. I said, we are here. We built a ship you did not think we could build, in a time frame you did not think was possible, using technology you believed was beyond us. We found a station you forgot existed and read documentation from a species you hoped would stay buried. We are standing in this chamber, which we were never supposed to reach, asking questions you were never supposed to have to answer. I paused. I said, and we are not angry. That surprised them. I could see it move through the room like a current. I said, we have been through 11 years of silence, 3 years of rebuilding everything from nothing, and a transit across the galaxy in a ship that sounds wrong during acceleration. We have earned the right to be very angry, and there is anger. I will not pretend there isn't, but anger is not what I came here to deliver. I opened the second part of my notes. This was the part that had taken me a long time to prepare. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I needed to say it in a way that was both completely honest and completely clear. I said, the sorrow tide is coming. You know that. The ORETH documentation includes a behavioral map that your own records partially corroborate. Based on the cycle data, it is coming earlier than your most recent projections suggested. Significantly earlier. And the reason I know that is because I have spent 11 years studying every piece of information that touched on it, which is considerably more time than any of your analysts have spent on it recently. Because when something has worked for 11,000 years, you stop questioning it. I put the map on the display. The map was something I was proud of in a quiet way that I don't say often. It had taken years. It was built from the ORETH cycle data, from fragments in council records I had accessed during my 9 years of legitimate access, from patterns in stellar cartography, from inference, and from the specific stubbornness of someone who needs to understand something and refuses to stop until they do. It showed the sorrow tide's path, its rhythm, its shape. And it showed something that the Council's own models had missed, partly because their models were built on the assumption that the sorrow tide would always have a buffer species to slow it, and therefore had never been calculated for a scenario in which it did not. It showed that without a buffer, the tide would reach 3 major Council worlds within decades. I said, for 11,000 years you have been managing this by spending others. The approach has worked. I am not here to pretend it hasn't, but it has worked because the tide always had something to consume before it reached you, something to slow it down. Slow it enough and the cycle dips. Dips enough and you have another few centuries. That is the math your policy is built on. I looked around the room. I said we were supposed to be the next slowdown, and we didn't cooperate. I let that land. Then I said, I have something else, and this is the part I need you to listen to very carefully. I had debated including this part. I had gone back and forth on it for weeks. It felt too strange. It felt like the kind of thing that would make me sound unhinged. But the ORETH documentation supported it, and my own analysis supported it, and at a certain point, you have to say the true thing even if the true thing is strange. I said, the sorrow tide is not mindless. The room responded to that, not loudly, but the quality of the silence changed. I said, the ORETH studied it for 3 centuries. Their documentation includes behavioral analysis that your council archives contain no equivalent of, because the council's approach to the tide has always been avoidance. You have never had reason to study it closely, but the ORETH did. And what they found is this. The tide moves in patterns that are too regular to be purely mechanical. It responds to resistance differently than it responds to absence. It does not pursue fleeing species with increased intensity. It does not slow when a species offers no resistance. The behavioral pattern is not predatory. It is not consuming out of hunger or aggression. I said, the best model the ORETH could build, based on 3 centuries of observation, suggests that the sorrow tide consumes because it encounters nothing that gives it reason not to. Another silence. I said, I know how that sounds. I have been sitting with it for a long time and I know how it sounds. But the data is in the documentation you are all looking at right now, and I would ask you to read it before you decide what to think. The chair said slowly, you are suggesting the tide can be reasoned with. I said, I am suggesting the tide can be engaged. I don't know if reasoned with is the right phrase. It is very old. It may not think the way we think. But the ORETH evidence suggests it is not indifferent to all stimuli. It has paused before, briefly, twice in 11,000 years. Both times the pause was associated with something unusual in the space it was moving through, something that didn't fit the pattern it expected. I said, "We are very good at not fitting patterns." No one in the room laughed, but one or two of them almost did. I could tell. I said, "I am not standing here with a guarantee. I am not offering a weapon. I am offering something much stranger and less satisfying than either of those things. I am offering the fact that we exist, against all of your projections, and the possibility that the reason we exist might be exactly what this situation needs." I sat down. The session that followed lasted 14 hours. I am not going to pretend it was smooth. It was not smooth. There were delegates who were furious at humanity, at the Council's own historical policy, at the situation in general. There were beings who argued that my behavioral analysis of the sorrow tide was speculation. They were not wrong. It was informed speculation, but it was still speculation. What I had, and what I kept returning to quietly and without drama every time the argument threatened to become purely abstract, was the Oreth map and my own map side by side. The tide was coming, earlier than projected. The old approach was not available because humanity had declined to be spent, and the only other option anyone in that room could produce was a military response that every military analyst agreed would fail. At the end of the 14th hour, the council chair called for a recess. During the recess, a delegate I had not met before came and sat beside me. She was from a species called the Iharan, not the captain I had known from trading days, but the same species. She sat quietly for a moment and then she said, in very careful English, "Captain Lissa spoke of you often. She said you were the first human she trusted." I said I was glad to hear that. I meant it. She said, "What you said in there about not being angry, was that true?" I said, "Most of it." She said, "What part wasn't?" I said, "The part where I said we earned the right to be angry. We did. And I am. I am just also tired of it, and anger wasn't going to get us anywhere useful today." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happens if your plan doesn't work?" I said, "Then we tried something, which is more than was tried before." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "For what it is worth, I voted against the ledger 11 years ago when they added your species. I voted against it." I said, "I know. I read the voting records in the Oreth archive. They were more complete than I expected." She blinked, which for a Iharan is the equivalent of a startled laugh. She said, "You already knew." I said, "I needed to know who to trust when I got here." She went back to her seat. The recess ended. The council voted on a motion to authorize a first contact engagement attempt with the sorrow tide, with humanity as the primary contact species, under full council observation, and with all resources requested made available without restriction. The vote was not unanimous, but it was clear. I went back to the ranker and told George to start preparing the broadcast array. He asked what we were going to say. I said I was working on it. I was up all night. I was 48 years old when we broadcast to the sorrow tide. I am 67 now, writing this. The years between those 2 points have not been quiet years, but they have been, on balance, the most meaningful years of my life. I did not expect to have a life after that broadcast. I want to be honest about that. I prepared everything I could prepare and I sent it out into the dark with the specific calmness of someone who has run out of alternatives and decided that running out of alternatives is, in its own way, a kind of freedom. The broadcast was not a weapon. It was not a declaration. It was not a plea. It was a conversation. I am a xenolinguist. I have spent my entire career on the problem of communication across difference. The hardest lessons in that field are not about vocabulary or grammar. They are about the fact that communication requires 2 things, something to say and the willingness to say it into silence without knowing whether anything is listening. The Oreth had done that. They had spoken into a silence that lasted 230 years. I found it. That is what saying something into silence actually means if you are patient enough. Eventually, someone finds it. The sorrow tide was old, older than the council, older than the ledger, older possibly than the organized civilization of any species currently alive. The Oreth's analysis suggested it had been moving through the galaxy since before most current stars had formed. It was not a ship. It was not a creature in any sense I could fully grasp. It was something the Oreth described, in the closest translation I could manage, as an accumulation, a pattern that had grown complex enough to have direction. A vast, slow, ancient moving thing that had encountered nothing in all its time, that gave it reason to change direction. I could not speak to it in a language. I used language as part of the broadcast, but not as the primary signal. Language assumes shared structure. I had no evidence of shared structure. What I had was the Oreth's observation that the sorrow tide responded to novelty, to things that broke its expected pattern, that it had paused twice in 11,000 years in response to something unusual. Humanity is unusual. We are, by galactic standards, almost pathologically unusual. We live short lives and spend large portions of them making things that serve no survival purpose. We communicate in hundreds of different languages on a single planet. We disagree with each other constantly and then cooperate anyway. We find things funny that are not funny. We attach deep emotional meaning to objects, to songs, to dates on a calendar. We remember the dead and speak to them even knowing they cannot answer. We build relationships with beings completely unlike us and then feel genuine pain when those relationships are damaged. I sent all of that. I sent music. Not one piece, not a curated selection, but everything. The complete recorded musical output of humanity up to that point, arranged not by genre or period but by emotional content, mapped against the cycle data for the sorrow tide so that the rhythm of what I sent mirrored, faintly, the rhythm I had spent years learning. I sent it the way you send something when you want the recipient to feel that you understand something about them. I sent it as a kind of recognition. I sent language. All the ones I knew, and many I didn't, translated phrases and untranslatable phrases side by side, and the specific category of words that exist in one human language and not others, because those words are the fingerprints of how a particular group of people see the world. The Portuguese word for the melancholy of something beautiful that is ending. The Japanese word for the sunlight filtering through leaves. The Arabic root that contains within it both the concept of longing and the concept of home. I sent these not as information but as texture, as evidence of what it is like to be us. I sent arguments, genuine human arguments, the kind that go in circles and resolve nothing and continue anyway because the act of continuing is itself meaningful. I sent recorded debates, scientific disagreements, philosophical texts that had been arguing with each other for centuries. I sent them because the Oreth analysis suggested the tide found absence of resistance more compelling than resistance itself, and I wanted it to understand that humanity is incapable of absence. We push back against everything, including each other, including ourselves, including the universe at large. I sent humor. I was aware that this was probably the strangest part of the broadcast, and that if anything was going to make me look unhinged to the council observers watching in real time, this was it. But the Oreth had noted something in their behavioral analysis that I kept returning to. The tide had paused, both times, in response to phenomena that were, by their best characterization, unexpected. Unexpected not in a threatening way. Unexpected in the sense of not fitting any pattern the tide had encountered before. And humanity's sense of humor is, by any objective measure, completely unprecedented in the galaxy. No other species laughs at the things we laugh at. No other species finds tragedy funny. No other species has developed the specific art form of making a serious point by saying something absurd with a straight face. I sent the jokes. I sent the absurd ones and the quiet ones and the ones that only work if you've lived long enough to recognize what they're about. I sent them without explanation, because explaining a joke is not a joke. And then at the end of the broadcast, I sent something I hadn't told the council about, something personal. I sent 11 years of my own notes, not the tactical analysis, not the Oreth documentation, not the maps, the other notes, the ones I had written during the silence for myself, because writing is how I think. The pages about Orvith and his game, The pages about the Iharan captain and the meal that tasted like finishing something difficult. The pages about George's voice on the phone at 2 in the morning, trying very hard to sound less frightened than he was. The pages about Paul's drive and the sound it made, and the fact that he named it spite and meant it as a compliment to himself. I sent the part where I cried in my office alone on the day the silence fell, and the part where I stopped crying and made a list instead. I sent the part where I was afraid, and the part where I went ahead anyway, and the part where I could not tell if those two things were different or the same. I sent it all, and then I sat in my chair on the bridge of the Rancor, and I waited. It took 18 days. Then the sorrow tide stopped. George was the first to say it aloud. He was watching the sensor array and he said, very quietly, "It stopped." And then he said nothing else for a while, because none of us had words ready for that. It stopped, not permanently, not forever. It did not turn and leave. It did not dissipate. It was still there. But it stopped moving in the direction it had been moving, and it stayed stopped, and that had not happened in 11,000 years of recorded galactic history for more than a few seconds at a time. It stayed stopped for 6 days. During those 6 days I sent more. I didn't know what to send, so I sent everything I could think of. More music, more arguments, more untranslatable words. I read aloud from a novel I had with me, a human novel about a botanist stranded on a distant planet who survives by growing food in the dust, and I do not know why I chose that one except that it felt right. I sent more of my own notes. I ran out of prepared material on the 4th day and started talking freely. The way you talk when you've stopped performing and are just being honest with the room. On the 6th day, we received a signal. It was not in any language. It was not in any format our systems recognized. It was a modulated tone, complex and layered, and it repeated in a pattern that took our analysts 3 days to determine was not random. We spent 2 weeks studying that signal. Every xenolinguist, mathematician, physicist, and musician we could reach was pulled in. The council sent researchers. The Iharan sent their best communications theorists. What we found, or what we believed we found, which is a distinction I have to keep making because certainty was never fully available in this situation, was that the signal was a response, not an agreement, not a language, something closer to an acknowledgement. The closest human concept I could find for it was this: the sound you make when someone says something that surprises you so completely that your first response is just to be still for a moment and take it in. The sorrow tide had taken it in. It moved again after that, but its path had changed, only slightly, but measurably, enough that 3 council worlds it had been projected to reach within 30 years were now outside its revised trajectory. The council wanted to call it a victory. I told them it was not a victory. It was a beginning. There is a large difference. The years that followed were not simple. They never are, and anyone who tells a story that ends with everything becoming simple after the hard part is leaving something out. The Galactic Council faced a reckoning about the ledger that was painful and long and that several species would have preferred to avoid entirely. The record was opened, all of it. The full list of species that had been spent over 11,000 years, the vote counts, the internal memos, the projections that had classified humanity as an acceptable strategic loss. Some council species refused to accept accountability. Some accepted it fully and immediately. Most fell somewhere in the complicated middle space that actual reckoning usually occupies. The debate went on for years. It is still going on in some chambers. I think it should go on. The ending of that debate is less important than the quality of it. The restructuring of the council took 4 years. When it was done, humanity held a position that had no name in the existing diplomatic framework because there was no precedent for it. We were not the youngest species anymore in terms of how we were treated. We were not the oldest either. We were something the council was still figuring out language for. A species that had been positioned as expendable and had refused the position. A species that had spoken to the untalkable thing, and it had, in whatever way it was capable of, listened. The Spite drive, improved substantially from Paul's original warehouse prototype, was released to every council species simultaneously. No trade conditions, no licensing fees, no diplomatic requirements. A human engineer named Deborah Cole, who had taken over Paul's work after he retired, presented the final technical documentation at a council science session and answered every question anyone had. She was there for 9 hours. She said afterward that she had enjoyed it immensely. When asked why humanity had shared the drive freely, without any arrangement in return, I gave the same answer I always give to that question, which is the true answer. We do things like that. We always have. It is not a strategy. It is just who we are. Strangers have fed us when we were hungry and asked for nothing back, and so we feed strangers when we can. It has always made the economists uncomfortable, and I find that very funny. I retired from active diplomacy at 63. I still consult. I still write. I have been working on this account for 4 years, which is longer than I intended, but it turns out that some things are harder to put into words than others, and I wanted to do it properly. My granddaughter is 9. Her name is Priya. She asks me very good questions, the way children do when they haven't yet learned to be polite about what they actually want to know. Last week she asked me if the council was bad. I told her the council had done a very bad thing for a very long time, and that many of the beings in it had not been bad beings, and that those two things were both true at once, and that learning to hold two true things that seem to contradict each other is one of the most important things a person can learn to do. She thought about this for a moment and then said, like how Orvith was your friend and also he didn't warn you. I said exactly like that. She said, do you still miss him? I said yes. She accepted this and moved on to her next question, which was about the Spite drive and whether it would ever be fast enough to reach the stars that are too far away to visit in a human lifetime. I told her I thought so, probably, if people kept working on it with enough stubbornness. She said that sounded like something humans were good at. I told her we had been told that by an alien species once. She thought that was very funny. There is a signal that comes in sometimes, not on any schedule, not in any pattern I have been able to map, and I have tried. It comes on the same frequency as that first response, the one we spent 2 weeks studying. It is always brief, always the same layered modulated tone, though the specific modulations change each time. Our analysts still work on each one when it arrives. We have never achieved what any scientist would call a full translation. What we have is an interpretation, a best reading, a sense of the signal rather than a decoding of it. The sense is consistent. The signal is checking in. I play the most recent one for Priya sometimes. She listens to it seriously, the way children listen to things they have decided are important. Last time she asked, "What do you say back?" I told her we send more of the same things I sent the first time. Music and arguments and untranslatable words, and honest accounts of what it is like to be alive and human and here. She said, "Does it understand?" I said, "I think it understands something. I'm not sure we understand what." She nodded like this was a satisfying answer. For me, that is the ending, not the restructured council or the shared drive or the changed trajectory of a thing older than most stars. Those are the facts. Those are what happened. The ending for me is this. They left us in the silence because they thought silence would bury us. They had done it before to others and it had always worked. They forgot, or perhaps they never knew, that we are not a species that does well with silence. We fill it. We reach into it. We send music and arguments and jokes and grief and honest accounts of being afraid into the dark, not because we know something is listening, but because we cannot help it. We are made of language and connection, the way other things are made of heavier elements. The Oreth sent a message into a silence that lasted 230 years, and I found it. The sorrow tide had moved through the galaxy for longer than human civilization has existed, and we talked to it, and it paused. Given enough time and enough stubbornness, we will talk to everything, and eventually the universe answers. That is not a boast. It is an observation. It is also, I think, the most human thing I know how to say.